Welcome back to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified, where we break down complex legal issues into bite-sized pieces for all you law students out there in India. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's,
Well, I'd say it's one that's close to my heart.
yeah,
It's about refugees during World War II,
right.
a time of global upheaval
Yeah.
that really tested international law and humanitarian efforts.
You know, when I think about this topic,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to get lost in the sheer scale of it all. Millions uprooted, borders redrawn, the entire world in chaos.
It's true.
Okay.
But what's so important is to remember that behind the statistics, there are real people with their own stories.
Yeah.
Stories of incredible resilience and bravery, and also of loss and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling, I think. We're not just talking about abstract legal principles, we're delving into the lived experiences of those caught in the crossfire of history.
Exactly. It's like those individual stories are like pieces of a puzzle, and when you put them together, they reveal this.
This much larger picture of the global refugee crisis during World War II.
Exactly. And it helps us understand how we got to where we are today in terms of international law
Right.
and the way we approach refugee crises now. So where should we begin with this?
Well, I think it's essential to start with the human side of things.
Yeah.
You know, even before the war officially broke out in 1939, there were individuals who recognized the looming crisis and stepped up to help.
Mm-hmm.
There's this one woman, Dorothy Thornycroft, who dedicated herself to supporting Basque refugee children. This was during the Spanish Civil War,
Oh, wow, yeah.
years before the World War even began.
And she was already...
She saw the need and she acted.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It really shows that individual actions can make a difference even in the face of such immense challenges.
Yeah, and it also shows that this was a crisis that was building for years.
Exactly.
It wasn't just a sudden explosion in 1939.
Right. And then you have someone like Doreen Warner,
Uh-huh.
a British economist who orchestrated this daring escape of hundreds of refugees from Prague right before the Nazi invasion.
Oh, wow. Talk about working under pressure. Imagine the logistics, the secrecy, the risks involved.
That's incredible.
It gives you a glimpse into the urgency and desperation of those times.
These stories are so powerful. They're a good reminder that behind the overwhelming statistics, there are individuals with hopes and fears, just like you and me,
Absolutely.
and just trying to survive in unimaginable circumstances.
Exactly. But unfortunately, not everyone's journey was marked by such incredible acts of bravery or
Yeah.
fortunate escapes.
Mm.
The sources we studied also highlight the struggles of German-trained refugee nurses who faced immense difficulty finding placements in British colonies. They had the skills and the desire to contribute, but they were often met with suspicion
Right.
and bureaucratic roadblocks. It's a stark reminder that even with the best intentions, navigating political hurdles and changing attitudes toward refugees was a huge challenge back then. And sadly, in many ways, it still is today.
Yeah. It makes you think about how those same challenges play out even now on a global scale. It's
Yeah.
really a timeless issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
But speaking of challenges, let's talk about the sheer scale of the refugee crisis during World War II. Trying to understand the magnitude of the displacement was a monumental task in itself.
Right. The sources mention the Inter-Allied Committee on Post-War Requirements.
The Leith-Ross Committee, as it's often called.
Yeah. And they were tasked with estimating the number of displaced people, which, in the middle of a war, I can only imagine.
I know, right? Communications disrupted, borders in flux,
It must have been like trying to count grains of sand on a windy beach. It's an impossible task.
And yet they persevered. Their estimates suggested that over 12.5 million refugees were displaced in Europe alone.
Wow. 12.5 million. And that's just Europe.
Exactly. And we also have to factor in the estimates of demographer Eugene Kulischer, who suggested that another 10 million Soviet citizens were moving eastward.
Yeah.
So the numbers were even larger than initially thought.
It's mind-boggling. And with so many people displaced, the need for coordinated relief efforts becomes even more critical, right?
Absolutely. That's where UNRRA comes in,
Yeah.
the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration.
I was just going to say that.
They played a massive role in coordinating aid, not just in Europe, but around the world. It's fascinating to look at the sheer scale and diversity of their operations.
What I found really interesting was their agreement with General Eisenhower to place UNRRA under the authority of FEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force.
Right, that was crucial.
It just goes to show how intertwined humanitarian aid and wartime logistics were at that time.
Absolutely. It was a recognition that in the midst of conflict, Providing relief to civilians was not just a moral imperative, but also a strategic necessity.
Yeah. But we also can't forget the specific challenges faced by Jewish refugees after the war.
Right.
Their situation raises some really important legal and ethical questions that still resonate today.
Absolutely. It's a complex and sensitive part of this history.
The sources describe how many Jewish refugees were initially repatriated to Poland, only to then infiltrate back into occupied Germany. Why would they do that?
Well, imagine you've just survived the horrors of the Holocaust. They're
Right.
finally free.
Yeah.
But returning to your former home is not an option.
Mm-hmm.
For many, going back to Poland wasn't a viable solution.
No.
So they sought refuge elsewhere, even if
Mhm.
it meant risking their lives to cross borders illegally.
It must have been a desperate situation.
It was, and it highlights the complex political landscape surrounding Jewish resettlement. It wasn't simply about offering refuge.
Hmm.
It involved navigating international agreements, competing interests, and deep-seated anxieties about migration.
Yeah. And those anxieties sometimes manifested in really problematic ways. The sources mention how LT General Sir Frederick Morgan even accused the Zionist movement of having a plan to undermine British control in Palestine.
Right, and those accusations fueled a lot of controversy
Yeah.
and really highlight the deeply conflicting perspectives at play at the time.
It just goes to show how sensitive and delicate the situation was,
It was.
especially for Holocaust survivors who were just desperately seeking a safe haven.
Absolutely. And for many, their journey led them to refugee camps,
Right.
which varied greatly in their conditions and management. Some were well organized, while others were really
More challenging.
challenging, yeah, to say the least.
The sources paint a contrasting picture. On one hand, you have El Shat in Egypt, which primarily housed Yugoslav refugees,
Mm.
and it's described as surprisingly well organized,
I know, right?
offering amenities like a clinic, schools, even a theater.
It's amazing to think about
Yeah,
those glimpses of normalcy amidst such extraordinary circumstances.
right. But it's also important to remember that even in a relatively well-run camp like El Shat, life was still incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. Residents faced restrictions,
Yeah.
and those who refused repatriation were often labeled as dissidents.
Oh,
Imagine that. You fled your home, you've survived a war, and now you're being labeled as a dissident for simply not wanting to return to a place that's no longer safe.
yeah, that's incredible.
It's a real testament to their resilience and determination.
And the sources also mention how the continued presence of refugees in Egypt became a source of embarrassment for the British government.
Right. It created this political pressure to find long-term solutions for these displaced populations. And eventually, many of these refugees were resettled to Australia.
It's fascinating to see how different countries grappled with these issues and how the lives of refugees were shaped by these political decisions.
It is. It really underscores the global nature of this crisis and how it continues to have ripple effects to this day.
But it's important to remember that not all camps were like El Shat.
Right.
Some became,
Hotbeds of tension, you could say,
Yeah.
political rivalries,
yeah.
adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
The sources talk about a camp in Naples, Italy, where tensions boiled over between different factions of Yugoslav refugees.
Mm-hmm.
There was even an incident where a repatriation officer was attacked.
It's a stark reminder that these weren't just homogenous groups seeking refuge.
Right.
They carried their political beliefs, their histories,
Their division
their divisions. Yeah,
with them.
exactly.
That must have been a huge challenge for authorities to try and maintain order in those situations.
Absolutely. But as we move into the post-war period, the focus shifts from immediate relief to this longer-term challenge of resettlement,
Right.
rebuilding lives,
Yeah.
integrating these displaced populations into new societies.
The sources mention how the British government started actively recruiting refugees
Yeah.
for work in various industries.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there was a need for labor in a recovering economy, but also a genuine desire to help refugees find their footing in a new country.
Yeah, it was a combination of factors, for sure. Pragmatism, but also a sense of humanitarian responsibility. There were these programs with names like Balt Signets and Westward Ho, which later evolved into European volunteer workers.
Those names are really interesting.
Aren't they?
They convey a sense of hope, new beginnings.
Exactly. A fresh start.
Yeah. But I'm curious, what kind of jobs were these refugees recruited for? Is there a specific selection process?
Well, the sources indicate they worked in a wide range of industries, everything from agriculture and textiles to coal mining and construction.
Oh, wow. So real variety.
Yeah, a real mix. And the selection process was often quite rigorous.
Really?
Yeah, candidates were assessed for their skills, their health, their character.
Oh, wow. So this is,
It was about finding the right fit
yeah.
for both the refugees and the employers.
And the sources mention that similar efforts were underway in other countries, like Belgium, which recruited refugees for their coal mines.
Right, so this wasn't just a British phenomenon.
Yeah.
It reflects a broader European trend
Yeah.
of recognizing the potential of refugee labor in post-war reconstruction.
It's a reminder that integrating refugees into the workforce can be beneficial for everyone involved.
Absolutely. It's about empowering individuals, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives.
And contribute to their new communities.
Exactly. But even with these resettlement efforts, it's clear that the crisis of displacement was far from over.
Right.
The sources paint a rather sobering picture,
Yeah.
estimating that even after the war ended, there were still around 175 million forced migrants worldwide
Wow.
due to ongoing conflicts and population transfers.
That's a staggering figure.
It is.
And it really underscores the enduring legacy of war and displacement.
It shows how the aftermath of conflict can continue to reverberate for generations,
Yeah.
leaving millions grappling with the consequences of violence, persecution, and displacement.
It's a reminder that simply ending a conflict doesn't magically solve the problem.
Right.
The scars run deep,
They do.
and the quest for durable solutions is a long and complex process.
Absolutely. It requires a sustained commitment
Yeah.
from the international community
Mm.
to address the root causes of displacement
Yeah.
and to create conditions that allow refugees and displaced persons to rebuild their lives with dignity and hope.
But amidst all this upheaval and uncertainty,
Mhm.
there was also this glimmer of hope on the horizon, right?
Yes.
This emergence of a new international order
Right.
dedicated to preventing future conflicts and promoting cooperation among nations.
Exactly. The formation of the United Nations in 1945 was a pivotal moment,
Yeah.
a collective commitment to building a more peaceful and just world.
Right. And the UN's founding charter, born from the ashes of World War II, it was a direct response to the horrors witnessed during the conflict
Absolutely.
and this determination to prevent such atrocities from happening again.
It was a recognition that the world needed a new framework
Yeah.
for international cooperation
Right.
to address shared challenges.
And to protect the most vulnerable among us.
Exactly.
And this global body, established amidst such devastation, it took on this monumental task. Yeah.
Of not only rebuilding peace, but also addressing the needs of millions of refugees who had been scattered across the globe.
It was a daunting task.
It was.
But it also represented a profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
A recognition that the international community had a collective responsibility to protect and assist refugees.
Did this lead to any specific legal frameworks for protecting refugees?
Absolutely. One of the most significant outcomes of this post-war period was the codification of the rights of refugees and the establishment of a legal framework for their protection.
So would it be fair to say that World War II, as horrific as it was, also served as a catalyst?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It forced the world to confront the issue of displacement on an unprecedented scale.
Right.
And to grapple with the need for a more robust and comprehensive system of international protection for refugees.
And this led to the drafting and adoption of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Right?
Exactly. A landmark international treaty
Yeah.
that remains the cornerstone of refugee protection to this day. It's amazing to think that this document, drafted over 70 years ago, is still relevant in addressing contemporary refugee crises.
It is. It speaks to the enduring nature of the principles enshrined in the convention.
Yeah.
Principles of non-discrimination, non-refoulement, and the right to seek asylum.
Can you tell us more about the key principles enshrined in this convention?
Sure. The 1951 Refugee Convention lays out a clear definition of who is considered a refugee, outlining their rights,
Yeah.
and the obligations of states towards them.
So it provides a framework for how countries should respond to refugee situations.
Exactly. It sets standards for the treatment of refugees and establishes mechanisms for international cooperation on refugee issues.
And one of the most important principles is non-refoulement.
Right. Non-refoulement prohibits countries from sending refugees back to a place where their life or freedom would be threatened.
That's such a crucial safeguard,
It is.
ensuring that refugees aren't forced back into harm's way.
Exactly. It's a fundamental principle of refugee law.
But what about other rights? Does the convention address things like access to basic needs, education, or employment?
Yes, absolutely. The convention also outlines the rights of refugees to access work, education, and social services,
Hmm.
recognizing the importance of enabling them to live with dignity and rebuild their lives. It emphasizes that refugees should be treated fairly
Right.
and should not be discriminated against based on their nationality or their status as refugees.
These provisions are so important
They are.
in fostering integration and empowering refugees to become self-sufficient members of their new communities.
Exactly.
But from what I understand, the 1951 Refugee Convention was initially limited in its geographical scope,
Right.
primarily focusing on Europe. Is that correct?
You're right. The convention's initial scope reflected the specific context of post-World War II Europe.
But recognizing that refugee crises are not confined to any one region,
Exactly.
the international community later adopted the 1967 Protocol, which expanded the convention's application to refugee situations worldwide.
Right. That was a crucial step
Yeah.
in recognizing the global nature of displacement.
And this expansion is so important in acknowledging the evolving nature of displacement and recognizing that refugee crises can arise anywhere at any time.
Absolutely. But I imagine that the challenges to international protection have only grown more complex in the decades since.
They have. The world has changed dramatically since the 1950s, and new challenges have emerged that test the limits of the 1951 Convention.
Right.
We're seeing new forms of conflict,
Yeah.
increased internal displacement.
Climate change.
Yeah, climate change.
All contributing to unprecedented levels of human mobility.
It's a reminder that while the 1951 Convention remains a vital foundation, it requires ongoing interpretation
Right.
and adaptation to address the complexities of the modern world.
Absolutely. It's not a static document.
Yeah.
It's a living instrument that needs to be interpreted and applied in light of contemporary challenges.
But before we delve into those complexities, I'd like to learn more about the organizations working on the ground to protect and assist refugees.
Of course.
The sources highlight the crucial role of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR.
A key player in the field.
Yeah.
An organization dedicated to providing protection and assistance to refugees worldwide.
I've heard of UNHCR, but I'm not entirely familiar with their history and mandate.
Sure.
Can you elaborate on their role in addressing the global refugee crisis?
Of course. UNHCR was established in 1950,
Okay.
initially with a 3-year mandate to help resettle European refugees after World War II.
So its roots are in that post-war period we've been talking about.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But as the landscape of displacement evolved,
Hmm.
so did UNHCR's mandate.
So it sounds like UNHCR's role has expanded significantly since it first began.
It has, yeah.
What are some of the key areas they focus on today?
Well, today, UNHCR's work goes far beyond just resettlement.
Yeah.
Their mandate now covers a much broader range of activities,
Mm.
reflecting the really multifaceted nature of refugee crises these days.
So what does that look like in practice? Can you give us some concrete examples of how UNHCR supports refugees on the ground?
Sure. Imagine a refugee camp, let's say, in a conflict zone.
Okay.
UNHCR might be providing the basics there, like tents,
Great.
food, clean water, medical care, for families who've had to flee their homes with practically nothing.
Yeah.
But in another context, you might find UNHCR working with governments to develop fair asylum procedures
Okay.
or advocating for the inclusion of refugee children in national education systems.
Wow. So it really runs the gamut.
It does, yeah.
It's incredible to think about the impact they have on so many vulnerable individuals.
It is.
Their work is a testament to what international cooperation can achieve when it comes to these global challenges.
It really is. But despite all these efforts,
Yeah.
the reality is millions of refugees remain displaced. Their future's uncertain. The sources we looked at highlight this staggering statistic that over 80 million people are currently forcibly displaced worldwide.
80 million.
More than the entire population of Germany.
It's hard to even fathom that number.
It is. It's a stark reminder that finding lasting solutions for these displaced individuals is more urgent now than ever.
Yeah. And it seems like the nature of displacement itself has become even more complex in recent years.
It has.
You mentioned internal displacement earlier. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. Internal displacement refers to situations where people are forced to flee their homes, but they stay within their own country's borders.
Okay.
They might be escaping violence, persecution, or natural disasters,
Right.
but they haven't crossed an international border, so they don't technically qualify as refugees under the 1951 Convention.
So that's a crucial distinction then.
It is.
Does this mean that internally displaced persons or IDPs don't have the same legal protections as refugees?
Sadly, that's often the case. Yeah. IDPs often fall through the cracks of international protection because they haven't crossed that international border.
So their situation is more complicated in a way
It is, yeah,
because they're still under the jurisdiction of their own government.
exactly. And often that's the very government they're fleeing from,
Oh, wow.
or the one failing to protect them.
So are there any legal frameworks in place to try and address this gap in protection for IDPs?
There are. The guiding principles on internal displacement were developed in 1998
Okay.
to provide a framework for protecting and assisting IDPs. These principles emphasize that states have a responsibility to protect their own citizens from displacement
Right.
and to provide assistance to those who are internally displaced.
It's a step in the right direction for sure.
It is.
But it sounds like there's still a long way to go
There is. Yeah.
in ensuring effective protection for this vulnerable population.
Absolutely. And we also talked about protracted refugee situations.
Right, those long-term displacements.
Exactly. And these present a whole other set of challenges,
Yeah.
often arising from unresolved conflicts, political stalemates, or just a lack of political will to find durable solutions.
It's heartbreaking to think about generations of refugees living in camps,
I know.
their lives on hold, unable to return home or build a future elsewhere.
It is. The Palestinian refugee situation, for example, has lasted for over 70 years.
Wow. It's hard to even grasp that timescale.
It is.
And it's a tragic illustration of how conflict and displacement can reverberate across generations.
Absolutely, leaving a deep scar on individuals, families, entire communities.
And the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis, which started in 2011, is another stark example of a protracted situation with no easy solutions in sight.
It is.
It's resulted in millions fleeing their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond.
And the strain on those host countries has been immense.
Yeah.
And the search for durable solutions continues. It really underscores the need for greater burden sharing among nations and for addressing those root causes of conflict that drive people from their homes in the first place.
So we've talked about conflict, persecution, internal displacement, but there's another growing driver of displacement that we haven't touched on yet: climate change.
You're right. The sources we looked at definitely highlight the growing impact of climate change on displacement patterns.
Yeah.
Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, environmental degradation.
It's forcing people to leave their homes in search of safety and survival.
Exactly. And this raises all sorts of complex legal and ethical questions about how we define and protect those displaced by climate change.
Yeah. Do you think the current legal frameworks are equipped to deal with this new wave of climate-induced displacement?
That's the big question, isn't it? The
Yeah.
1951 Refugee Convention, while a cornerstone of international protection, was drafted in a different era. It doesn't explicitly address climate change or other forms of displacement that aren't directly related to persecution.
So how do we bridge that gap? Are there any discussions or proposed solutions to try and address this emerging challenge?
There are definitely ongoing discussions and debates within the international community about how to best address climate-induced displacement.
Okay.
Some advocate for expanding the definition of a refugee to include those fleeing climate change, while others propose developing entirely new legal instruments specifically tailored to climate displacement.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It is.
But one thing's clear. We need creative and forward-thinking solutions.
Absolutely.
It seems like we've only scratched the surface of this really multifaceted topic.
We have.
But as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those interested in pursuing a career in law?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that the legal frameworks governing refugee protection, they're not static.
Right.
They're constantly evolving.
Yeah.
They're shaped by history, by politics, by changing global realities.
So it's a dynamic field.
It is.
And as future legal professionals, it's crucial to stay informed about these developments,
Absolutely.
to think critically about how the law can be used to protect the rights and dignity of displaced persons.
Couldn't agree more.
It's also important to remember that behind the legal complexities and the statistics, there are real human stories
Yes.
of resilience, courage, and hope.
Don't forget those.
Yeah. And by understanding those individual experiences, we can better appreciate the human cost of displacement and the importance of finding just and compassionate solutions.
I completely agree. And we also shouldn't underestimate the power of individual action.
Right, like we talked about at the beginning of.
Exactly. Those acts of kindness, courage, compassion,
Yeah?
they can make a real difference in the lives of refugees.
Well said. This has been a truly insightful deep dive. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on LexTalks. Stay tuned and subscribe for more practical insights into Indian law.